Welcome to the HIT podcast, H.I.T, Human Resources, Insurance, and Technology. I'm your host, Toby Kennedy. As always, we are dropping into your feed on Tuesdays with what I hope are bite-sized, digestible, awesomely curated little bits of what's going on in this space. This week's episode is brought to you by Montage Insurance Solutions. And without any further ado, let's get right into our topic. This week's episode, I bring on Robert Romar, and I'm very excited to have him on. Robert, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. We were just talking a little bit about your trip into bear country and out seeing some of nature.
A few mountains, a few bears, a few trees. Got the kids out in the fresh air.
Super sweet. So, Robert, you are our Director of Property and Casualty here at Montage Insurance Solutions, and you have been doing this sort of thing for a little while.
Few years. I've been here at Montage about 7.
Yep.
Actually, just passed the anniversary, December 1st.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you very much. And about 20 years in the industry.
Yeah, and primarily in commercial and on the property casualty side.
100% commercial.
Right. There we go. So when I thought about cyber liability and I thought about bringing this to our audience, you're the guy who was like, hey, listen, if we're going to have a conversation about this, let me get the actual expert in the room. Let me get the big brains here and let's talk about this stuff. So if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is take our audience just from a high level. When someone talks about the risk of cyber liability or the need for cyber liability or a policy of cyber liability, what are we even talking about?
Yeah, so cyber liability is really coverage for theft of confidential data. And just about everything is confidential these days. We all have data, credit cards, driver's license, those things. So we've seen the hacks. Blue Shield had a big one. Vegas had a big one. Shut down Vegas for a while. So
if you think you're impervious, you probably not.
Exactly. Everybody's subject to it. It's even affected the government. So it goes all the way up the line.
So this is for companies that house data in some electronic place.
Exactly.
So obviously when you're old school, a bank or a jeweler, and you've got physical property that if someone steals, you know the value of that, sure. Right? With the digital stuff, what are the consequences for employers that are housing this stuff that's now digitally valuable? Are people going to sell the data? Are the employers going to have some sort of ramifications? What's the consequence?
Sure. Certainly the employers could have some responsibility for that, but we've all had the hacks. We've seen that. People have lost their credit. They can hack into your bank accounts, hack into your credit cards, those different types of things. So it's intellectual rather than a physical property. So it's a little bit more hard to define that tangibly, but certainly just as important.
And because it's different, and insurance carriers are great with their contract nuance, it's probably or certainly not covered on other policies?
Certainly. There used to be some small enhancements on a business owner's package policy, but now you need a specialized cyber liability policy to protect these coverages.
So if you're an employer out there and you have, well, first of all, let's back this up. What type of employer does this even apply to?
Everybody that's got confidential data. So anybody that's housing any kind of data, again, credit cards, date of births, even email addresses, phone numbers, cell phones. So anybody that has confidential data.
There's a market for people stealing anything digital. So exactly. You're an employer and you've got this digital vault that's full of whatever. And you think you're okay because maybe you've got these other policies. If you don't have a cyber liability policy, you're telling me right now, more than likely, if there's a loss, they don't have coverage.
That's correct.
Okay, so they need to go out and probably get a cyber liability policy to sleep at night?
I would.
Okay, so I know it's kind of the wild, wild west a little bit out there, and maybe unpack for me, like, what does a cyber liability policy cover? What doesn't it? What are some of the ranges of coverages? Because it's a little newer.
It's newer. We've been saying that for years now, so it's out there for 10-ish, 15 years.
Well, as opposed to ship fires.
Exactly, but it's still a newer coverage out there. So it is definitely the Wild West, as you mentioned, and there are no standardized ISO forms. So the Insurance Servicing Office.
ISO for me.
Yeah, Insurance Servicing Office, and they're a company out there that regulates policy forms. And none of those are used in cyber liability at the moment. So every carrier has their own technology, their own terminology, and their own coverage package. So saying I have cyber liability is not saying I have everything. It's saying I have something.
Interesting. So, and not to plug us and you, but this sort of gets in the spot where it's like, whoever your consultant is, you really need to have a conversation about this one because, for example, when you're buying work comp, you're buying work comp, right?
It's standardized.
Standardized. I know what I'm getting. I bought the policy. There's no better or worse
Right.
work comp, right? For the most part.
Coverage-wise.
Right. There's services and there's things that go along with it. But from a policy standpoint, there's more standardization.
Absolutely.
You get into cyber liability, it's sort of like saying I went to a restaurant. Like, what does that mean? Did you go to Michelin one? Did you go to Taco Bell? Like, what do you got, right?
Absolutely. Nothing standardized there. So you definitely want to make sure that you've got the coverage enhancements. There are a few standardized coverages in cyber liability, but certainly some specialized ones.
What are some of the standardized stuff?
So things like network security and privacy liability. It's going to cover things like data breach, regulatory defense and fines, investigation costs, things like that, ransomware. But then you get into things like cybercrime, cyber extortion, social engineering, some of those more standardized
Can you unpack some of those terms for me?
Specifically, social engineering is a big one these days, and that's when somebody's impersonating somebody else to try and extort money from them. We get these emails all the time from our CEO, where it's like, hey,
can you the bank number real quick?
Exactly. Can you buy 10 Amazon gift cards and send me the numbers on the back, those types of things. And we've had a few of those claims here in the office. Some covered, and some folks had cyber liability, and others, unfortunately, didn't quite have that coverage yet.
So that's the type of stuff that you might have thought might have fallen under a different policy that really will just be excluded.
Correct.
Okay, so let's just say I'm someone out there that got tasked by my employer to look into cyber liability, and I bumped into you in the street. I was like, oh, good, I'm so glad I bumped into you. What a coincidence. You're wearing a shirt that says ask me about cyber liability. Other than the stuff we've covered today, what might you tell that person?
Well, first get it, and then first really dive deep into it with your broker. Take a look at it. When we do our proposals, the cyber liability can be multiple pages. It can be 13 pages of different enhancements and how the different carriers are going to interpret these different coverages. As we mentioned, nothing is standardized. So it's very difficult to compare one to the other. So again, they can be very comprehensive. So make sure you dive down. What type of data do you have? What's your exposure? And really dive down to make sure that this cyber liability is going to meet your company's needs. What
are some of the, I know nothing's standard, but some of the limits or some of the coverages you would say, hey, you really want to try to look at this level or this coverage?
Yeah, so $1 million is kind of the starting point, but we are starting to notice some going up $2 million, $3 million, even $5 million, and some of these are becoming contractual requirements. For your vendors out there saying, hey, you're going to need to carry a limit of $3 million or $5 million, depending on the data that you have. So social engineering, that type of thing is very important, but very sublimited. Right. Some of these carriers not even offering this coverage in California anymore. And, so sublimit on that, probably $250,000 is probably a cap on the cybercrime type coverage.
Okay. And then when we're looking at this stuff, I understand the spreads could be 13 pages because you're really comparing apples and oranges. For a standard-ish policy, what's a range-ish from a premium standpoint? What are we talking about here?
Well, luckily, cyber liability is still fairly inexpensive in the grand scheme of things. It's not going to touch your workers' comp premium, your errors and omissions, or those types of things. So starting premiums probably in the couple $1,000 range. Okay. And I'd say $5,000, $10,000 would be a kind of a standard cap. Certainly, as you go up in the limits, the $3 million, $5 million, you might do $15,000, $20,000 or more. And again, that's also dependent on what type of information you have, how much of it. So data records is a big thing, a rating basis. How much data do you have out there that needs to be protected, and revenue.
So, and I was going to ask also on the work comp side, one way to make it cheaper for you is do a good job of not having accidents.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
On the cyber side, is there anything you can do to make your premium cheaper?
Absolutely. So things that you want to have in place, things like passwords, strong passwords. You want to have backups, frequent backups, offsite if possible. You don't want to have your backup tape sitting in the same room as your server and then have your server hacked and then your data is right there as well, your backup. Right. Software updates, patches. Microsoft releases all these security updates. Well, that's a nice little flag that, hey, there's a hole in this program, and it's a nice way for hackers to kind of back into things. So you want to make sure once those updates are released, you're installing them, your IT team.
And these sorts of best practices that you're listing out, this is something to where there is a space for it with the underwriter. Like you as the consultant, when you're in that chair and anyone out there talking to their consultant, you should be gathering this information from the client and telling this to the underwriter, right?
Absolutely. Generally included on the application of what are your security measures and protocols to mitigate these risks.
And we talked a little bit about how there's not necessarily a standard app. So what I'm hoping to do is tease out maybe even a couple extra nuggets and tell people, look, if you are shopping for these policies, here's a few things that if it wasn't already disclosed to the underwriter, try to get this information to them because it might mitigate your premium.
Yeah. So when you're going through the application, if all those answers are no to, hey, we don't do any of these, let's change that before we submit the application.
And then we'll price this out for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Any parting thoughts on cyber besides, look, it's important. It's a little bit on the newer end. It's nuanced in the aforementioned ways. And it's probably one of the more important policies going forward, right?
Absolutely. And the sooner you get it, the better. Once you have that hack, it's much more difficult to obtain the coverage, unfortunately. So get that coverage in place, get it going. These policies are claims-made policies, so you want to make sure that you get that coverage enforced, because anything that happens before that claims-made retroactive date, not going to be covered. So you want to make sure you get that policy enforced as soon as possible.
You can't wrap your car around the tree and then ring up Geico and ask for auto insurance.
It can't insure the burning building, right?
Yeah. It's probably a better way to put it. And I'm sure you've been asked that, where you have some clients that say, we just had this big thing. Now I've got cyber on my mind. And you're like, that's great, but it's great going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, get it now, get it early. Bump up those limits.
What's the joke? The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago, and the second best time is today?
Right now. Yeah. Get it going.
Cool. Okay. Thank you so much for unpacking this with us. And of course, if anyone wants to get a hold of you, Robert at montageinsurance.com. Of course, clients can ask, and non-clients and friends, you're happy to have them bounce questions up to you?
Absolutely. Happy to answer any questions.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert, for being here. That's all the time we have for this week. Until next week, make this the best week yet.